All right, we have an amazing interview for you guys today. It's Michael Isikoff. He's the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, and he did something amazing. He went and got an interview with Bashar al-Assad, the leader of Syria. I don't know how he did that. I want to ask him. And he also confronted Assad with pictures of his own torture victims. So absolutely fascinating interview. Mike, welcome back to the Young Turks. How are you, man?
Hey, good to be with you.
All right, great to have you. So before we get into the torture victims and how you got the interview and all the other details, let's not bury the lead. He apparently talked about us. So
yes, he
what
did.
was
unprompted,
the context?
By the way, totally unprompted. So look, long convoluted story, and needless to say, I never imagined this was going to come off, but sometimes things do, and it did. And I find myself a week and a half ago in Damascus, Syria, and we go to the presidential media office, and then they take us for the interview with their president, Bashar al-Assad, to one of his offices, not the presidential palace, but a presidential office that wasn't even really marked. They drive us up, we open the door, and there he is. Hi, Bashar al-Assad. Hi, Mike Isikoff. Good to meet you. He takes me and our fixer off into a little private room and just wants to chat for a while about the state of the media, print versus online, how people are getting their news these days. He tells me he likes to watch O'Reilly to get the hard right view. And I say, that's interesting. Yes, that would be the hard right view. And then he says he likes to watch the Young Turks. I mean, who knew? Out of nowhere, he's watching you. Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, in the middle of a civil war, is watching the Young Turks.
That's amazing. I'm amazed by so many parts of the story. First is that he's a dictator, and he views Fox News as the hard right.
Yeah. Well, look, it's a very strange political environment, but he's adapted the lingo of American politics, as you'll see. And I hope we're going to play a couple of clips, but twice during the interview, when I confronted him with his well-documented record of human rights abuses, his response is, it's fake news.
Is it true or not?
No, it's not true. Definitely not true.
How do you know? Do you know what goes on in that prison? Have you been there?
No, I haven't been. I've been in the presidential palace. You can forge anything these days, and we're living in a fake news era, as you know. Everybody knows this.
The interview was the day Amnesty International released its really chilling report on Sednaya prison, where there have been something like as many as 13,000 people hanged after 1 to 3 minute sham trials, hooded detainees who were political protesters for the most part, tried, convicted, executed, and then buried in mass graves. The report from Amnesty International came out the day of my interview. I'm in Damascus. As soon as I heard about it, went down. I was staying at the Four Seasons Hotel in Damascus. And by the way, you can get a pretty good deal at the Four Seasons Hotel in Damascus right now if you're looking for a vacation spot. And I went down to the business center, printed out the report from Amnesty International, had it on my lap when I interviewed him. And his response is, it's fake news. Right? Where's the evidence? Fake news.
Yeah.
And then I presented him with copies of the Caesar photos. And I don't know if you know the story behind these photographs, but they are really as shocking as anything you will ever see. Caesar is the code name for a regime photographer who worked for Assad, whose job was to document the torture and execution of prisoners in Syria. And these photos he smuggled out of Syria, turned over to the opposition and then the U.S. State Department. They've since been shown in the Holocaust Museum because they are images right out of the Nazi Holocaust. You see these emaciated, tortured, burned, beaten bodies lined up one after another in row after row. There was a lawsuit filed by one of the family of one of the victims just a couple of weeks ago in the Spanish National Court, citing these photos. The woman saw her brother, identified her brother as one of the tortured bodies in those photographs. I asked him about these photographs. His initial response is, these are doctored. These are Photoshopped. These aren't real photos. And I said, have you seen them? And he said, no, I haven't really seen them. And I whipped them out. I had a copy on me, showed them to him. He again stuck to these. How can you verify this? How can you show these are authentic? And I happen to have an FBI report because the FBI digital lab in Quantico had examined these photos and concluded they showed no signs of manipulation. They depicted real events and real people. And I showed him the FBI report. And again, he returned to the mantra used by everybody these days about stories they don't like: fake news.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason that that they did that. Of course, they wanted to muddy the waters. So
sure.
when they did, the right wing did the fake news on Facebook, et cetera, they then charged everything with fake news, so you wouldn't know what's what. It was actually kind of a brilliant strategy, actually, to give them credit. And I want to provide the links to Mike's interviews with Assad, and they're really powerful, in the description box below this video once we put this up online. So I want everybody to check those out and watch them for yourself when he's confronted with the pictures. But Mike, why you? So he wants to, I guess, get a message out to the world, but you're known as a tough reporter.
Yeah.
I wonder why he, of all the people, is it that you're the one who asked? Why did he pick you to get it?
It's really hard to say, and how one gets these interviews is so happenstance. You never know how things come about. I have a number of sources in the world of the Middle East fixer community, people who represent foreign governments, foreign groups that are maybe not in good standing with the United States, but who, do business in Washington, try to hook up, try to present their story to an American audience, to American opinion makers. And one of these guys, who I've had a longstanding relationship with me, I ran into at the Republican convention in Cleveland last summer, and he said, would you like to interview Assad? And I said, sure, I'd love to interview Assad. I mean, he's somebody who definitely would be on my list to ask some tough questions of. This guy sent me up with another guy who was a Cleveland businessman of Lebanese extraction who had ties to that community and to the Assad regime. I had lunch with him. We talked about it. I never imagined anything was going to come of it. Nothing did for months. And then 3 months later, the guy's brother, a California businessman, calls me up and says, I understand you'd like to interview President Assad. I think I can help arrange. And sure enough, he delivered.
That's amazing.
So, I mean, how it happens, it's not an easy thing. You can't fly to Damascus. The airport is closed. It's still, the country is still in a state of civil war. Myself and a producer flew to Beirut. We drove through the Bekaa Valley and right into Syria. It was, I was a little apprehensive. On the other hand, I'm there to interview their president. So the Syrian government had a certain interest in making this happen and making sure my trip went smoothly, and it did. We drove into Damascus, stayed at the Four Seasons Hotel Executive Suite. A lot of Russians there, by the way. And I do remember the first night we went out to a fancy restaurant. There is a sense of normalcy in Damascus right now. Assad's on he's feeling emboldened, thanks to the Russians. They've retaken eastern Aleppo. They're, got the upper hand in this incredibly bloody and horrific civil war. We went out to this fancy restaurant. There was like very well-dressed Syrians sitting at a big table, smoking hookah. One of them was the sister of Assad's wife, his sister-in-law. And we hear off in the distance mortar fire. Because in the suburbs, there's still rebel-controlled areas, and the explanation was when the rebels start moving, the Syrians shoot off the mortars to let them know, stay back, stay where you are.
Yeah.
So it's still a country at war.
Yeah, look, there's two things that I get out of that. First of all, the lesson is you never know what you can do if you just try. So, you said yes, you try to get an interview with Assad, and you did. And
you
so,
never know.
That's right. And so I love that lesson. And then I got to give you credit, man. That's a lot of courage, because I'm not sure if somebody said to me, hey, don't worry, I got the hookup with Assad. Let me drive you through the Bekaa Valley and get you to Damascus. My answer is probably no, thank you. I appreciate that you had the courage to do that and give these very, very interesting insight into Assad. So let's talk about that for a second. Sure. So he obviously thinks he's got a case to make. That's why he wanted to get his message out to the world and to America. So he doesn't think he's the bad guy. Almost no one ever does. So,
in his view, his enemies are all terrorists, and he's saving his country from terrorists. And look, there's no question. ISIS is there. The al-Nusra Front are there. They are terrorists. That is a frightening thing to a lot of Syrian people. What's left of the moderate opposition is far from clear at this point. He's locked a lot of them up. He's tortured them. He's executed them. And so, to some extent, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He's now left with an opposition that is, to a very large extent, really bad folks. Now, that begs the question about the nature of him and his regime. I got to say, although there is a sense of normalcy in Syria, it is a bit creepy. You walk around Damascus, the posters of Assad are everywhere. Assad with his father, Assad with Nasrallah, Assad wagging his finger at you, Assad in sunglasses, Assad in military fatigues. It's very much a feeling like you're in George Orwell's 1984, and this is Big Brother. It's not like there is a alternative voice in Syria for people to listen to.
Well, except for the Young Turks, apparently. We're there, and
I'm sorry.
Except for the Young Turks, apparently.
Except for the Young Turks.
Yeah.
Well, he watches it. I don't know how many Syrians in general are watching you. I don't want to puncture your balloon a little bit, but you are being watched by their president. So
I hope that the others can see it too. So, you sat face to face with them, and so what you describe is a really interesting picture too of the surroundings, and it almost feels like a B-rate movie where you see the pictures of the dictator everywhere in different poses for propaganda purposes. As he but he's educated in the West. He's a relatively bright
London
guy.
educated doctor, an ophthalmologist. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yet he's got to sleep at night. So he's got to know that they're torturing people, as you showed him. He certainly knows that they're doing the obscene and absurd propaganda of him everywhere. He knows that they locked up the moderates and did far worse than that. So how do you think? I mean, sure, it's easy to call al-Nusra and ISIS terrorists, but how do you think he justifies that? Do you think that he's just trying to find a way to not feel so guilty, or do you think no, he's got a clean conscience? They all had it coming, and it's a good thing I saved the country.
Who knows what goes on, inside the recesses of one's mind. It is worth remembering that not too many years ago, the U.S. government and people in the West viewed Assad as somebody they could deal with, as somebody who had this Western background, speaks fluent English, comes off as quite amiable when you talk to him in person, soft-spoken, a little bit dorky, actually. But, John Kerry and his wife flew over to Damascus and had dinner with Assad and his wife. We're talking circa 2009. Sarkozy, the president of France, invited him to dinner in Paris. I mean, Assad was sort of being cultivated in the West. So he can present that side of himself. Then, of course, the Arab Spring broke out. Demonstrations throughout Syria. He cracks down in this incredibly brutal way, and that leads to the civil war. I think in his mind, he's fighting for his country and he's doing whatever it takes to save his country from the jihadis, from the militants. That's his view of the world, and I think he probably completely, filters out everything else. But does he? Look, I asked him. I actually quoted in the interview, and you can watch the full interview on Yahoo. It's a 35-minute interview. I quoted from him a speech that President Obama gave in 2013 about drone strikes, in which Obama for the first time acknowledged that, while defending drone strikes to kill terrorists, said, but it is a fact that sometimes we kill innocent civilians in these strikes, and we are haunted, these were Obama's words, haunted by the knowledge that we have killed innocent civilians. I asked him, I quoted that from him, I said, are you haunted by the innocent civilians you have killed in Aleppo and elsewhere? And he didn't take the bait. It was clear he was not. So
I think that speaks even more poorly of him, because it's actually a relatively easy thing, as Obama did. And I'm not sure how much credibility I give Obama, but it is at a minimum a savvy, if not a moral thing to do, to say, of course civilians have been killed on both sides, and it breaks our heart. And the fact that he wouldn't even do that, I think, speaks more poorly of him.
He does not acknowledge that at all. Now, a couple things I should say is, first of all, this was the first interview he'd given since Trump became president. So it was, very interesting to hear what he would say about Trump, U.S. troops in Syria, safe zones in Syria. He, and people read the interview in different ways, because at first point when I asked him, President Trump is considering injecting more troops, U.S. troops, into Syria to fight ISIS, Apache helicopters on your soil to fight the bad guys you're fighting. What's your reaction to that? His first reaction is, well, if you go through my government and you work with us and the Russians, and let's not forget the Russians, because the Russians are the people who have saved his regime, then it's fine. But then he went on to say, he would welcome U.S. troops as long as you play by our rules. Now, and then I asked him about the safe zones, and he says, well, safe zones are a bad idea. That really, it's not realistic. It would never work. So it was interesting because Reuters did a story on my interview and said, led with the safe zones, Assad rejecting the safe zones. The New York Times wrote a story about the interview and says Assad sends a signal to Trump saying he would welcome U.S. troops. So you can read it in different ways. I will say, I do want to talk about one thing that's important, which is, the humanitarian crisis caused by this civil war. 4.8 million refugees, Syrian refugees, who have fled the country since this civil war began. Mm-hmm. That is such a staggering number, just to put that in context. And this is something everybody should think about. And I brought this up with Assad. It's 5 times the total number of Palestinian refugees from 1948. Yeah, so think about that. We are still grappling with the Palestinian refugee crisis from the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. This is 5 times that number. And I pressed Assad on the solution. What are we going to do about your own countrymen? I asked him about Trump's executive order banning Syrian refugees from the United States. He said, well, I don't want to get involved in U.S. politics, but they are definitely terrorists. There's no question about that. Doesn't take a lot. I can't tell you how many, but they're definitely terrorists. So sort of saying Trump's right to keep my people out, right? So where are they going to go?
Well, part of it is,
that's kind of staggering in its own right. Showed absolutely no real compassion, concern about his own countrymen who are living. And by the way, on the way out of Damascus, we went to a refugee settlement center in the Bekaa Valley, and it's just heartbreaking to see that. We did a video on that. I hope you'll put up a link to our video on our visit to the refugee settlement. You see these kids. Little kids have living in tents, no school to go to. Their parents can't get work permits because the Lebanese government won't give them work permits. These are people just sitting in tents in Lebanon. There's 1.6 million in Lebanon. No place to go. Nowhere, no solution in sight. Right. It's a really horrific humanitarian crisis.
Yep.
That's going to be with us for a long time.
That's absolutely right. We got to leave it right there, but we will put up all the links to the videos and the interview that Mike's talking about in the description box. Check that out. Powerful, powerful interview and videos coming in from Syria, unlike almost any that we've seen before. And I don't want people to get the wrong impression as we leave you. But part of the reason he says that some of the people leaving are terrorists is because, yes, some are running from ISIS, but some are running from him. And so he has a vested interest in calling his opponents terrorists. So that's why, in this case, Trump, Russia, and Assad are aligned. And I wish they weren't, but in some ways they are.
Let me just say, in the video, which we'll link to, we met somebody in one of these refugees camps whose mother had died in Sadnaya prison. Sadnaya prison was what that Amnesty International report was about, where the mass hangings took place. And this was a guy who could give firsthand evidence. My mother was killed there in Assad's prison.
So everybody check all those videos out. Mike Isikoff, Chief Investigative Correspondent for Yahoo News. Thank you for joining us on the Young Turks. Really appreciate it, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.